Following lecture is devoted to a relevance theoretic analysis of misunderstanding. Misunderstandings from the pragmatic point of view can be viewed as a combination of certain continua. So the intentional versus unintentional, the verbal versus non-verbal, and the explicit versus the implicit continuum. The claim made by Francesco Jus was that these pragmatic aspects were not clear-cut dichotomies, but fuzzy-edged qualities that tended to overlap during interaction. Now, perhaps the last of these, that is explicit versus implicit, is a bit problematic because relevance theories in general are very strict about the distinction between what they consider to be fully explicit and what they consider to be implicit. So perhaps instead of one continuum, the explicit versus implicit, two such continua should be proposed. The first one is the explicit continuum, within which certain forms are still found to be more explicit and some other forms are less explicit and more implicit, but still within the same explicit dimension. And the other continuum, which is fully implicit. Again, there are certain degrees of implicitness within that continuum. Perhaps we'll explain that later on and it will be a bit clearer. So now perhaps we'll discuss the difference between this explicit continuum and implicit continuum. So within the explicit continuum there will be factual information. So that will be the explicit end of the E continuum. So factual information goes beyond question, but then certain phrases, search phrases like politeness formulae. So could you possibly do this instead of do this? Okay, so it is not a direct form, but still explicit. Non-implicative metaphors, that is fossilized metaphors, and these fossilized metaphors turned explicit due to conventionalization. We no longer perceive them as metaphoric utterances. Okay, so we can say that they belong to the explicit continuum. Standardized expressions, an utterance goes beyond the literal meaning but can be explained without special conventions. So performative utterances, standardized non-literality, context-bound but still explicit impliciture, various cases of singular reference including referential uses of definite descriptions. So all these will belong to the implicit end of the E continuum. Therefore, we can notice that utterances that we produce exhibit different degrees of explicitness, from the most explicit to the more implicit but still explicit information. So this more implicit but still explicit information is mainly represented by loose talk. If we say, I'm running to the bank, or I need a Kleenex in English, perhaps you remember these examples, we cannot say that we understand them literally, because it is not a Kleenex that I actually need, but any disposable tissue, and that I'm not actually running, but I'm walking fast to the bank. But still, we do not perceive such utterances as implicit. So this is what is meant by the degree of explicitness, that if I say 6 and it is 6 sharp, then it is the most explicit possible utterance. But if it is, let's say, 5 to 6, or I say 6, it is less explicit, more implicit, so it is loose talk. But still, all such expressions belong to the level of explicitness, that is to the E continuum. Now, if you look at these utterances, they all are placed inside the limits of the E continuum. I wonder if you could possibly be so kind as to pass the salt, please. Can you pass the salt, and pass me the salt, please? So they differ obviously in their form, but they represent the explicit continuum. The shift from the explicit continuum to the implicit continuum takes place if we answer the question whether the interpretation is a development of the logical form of the utterance or is not. So, can you pass me the salt? Are you sitting near the salt? Can you pass the scissors? Have you got a pair of scissors handy? So, can you pass me the salt seems to be more explicit, because it is a development. It is a development of the logical form, pass me the salt. But are you sitting near the salt? It's not. So it should be perhaps shifted to the implicit continuum. Can you pass the scissors? Have you got a pair of scissors handy? Again, it seems that perhaps the difference is more or less the same, though have you got a pair of scissors handy can be treated as a standardized expression. So one more time, can you pass the salt and have you got a pair of scissors handy are fixed in their shared use. So they lose much of their implicative potential and cross the boundary into the implicit side of the explicit continuum, together with the invalidation of other covered explicitness, that is the ability meaning and the position meaning. And the speakers finally use them without realizing their inherent ambiguity. So let me explain that. Now, can you pass the salt literally means, are you able to pass the salt? And have you got a pair of scissors handy? Literally means, are you in possession of a pair of scissors? More or less. And obviously they lose that meaning altogether, and they are not even perceived as capable of expressing that meaning. So, as you can see, they are not direct utterances, but nevertheless they have been used so often in that particular meaning that now they are no longer perceived as even being capable of expressing a different literal meaning. So we are not aware of their inherent ambiguity. So for that reason, they are believed to belong to the explicit continuum. Now, on the other hand, are you sitting near the salt indicates that there are other more explicit ways of communicating the information, and the speaker must be aware of the extra processing effort that he is demanding. So instead of saying, are you sitting near the salt, the speaker might say, pass the salt please. And it is less costly in terms of the cognitive effort required, so it is more relevant in a way. If the speaker chooses this particular form, are you sitting near the salt, perhaps the speaker believes that some extra cognitive effects will be communicated. So we may consider this one as belonging to the implicit level, but as you can see, the boundary is quite difficult to establish between these two continua. Now, another problem is constituted by metaphors. So metaphors which are novel at first are finally incorporated into the normal, ordinary, explicit use of language and become fossil metaphors belonging to the explicit continuum, like the prices have gone up. The speaker is likely not to be aware of conveying a metaphorical message and will regard it as explicitly communicated information. So such metaphors lose their implicitness and can be classified as representing the explicit continuum. Only when the speaker is aware of trying to relate two conceptual mappings in an innovative, metaphorical way would a shift into the implicit continuum take place. A transfer may also occur in the opposite direction, that is from the explicit continuum to the implicit continuum. In this case, this is perhaps not so frequent, but still possible. In this case, the implicative reading of the utterance is more salient than the initial explicit reading. And this implicit meaning is finally used consistently by a community of users, depriving the utterance of its explicit sense. So we may conclude that the two continua show a great deal of permeability. So an example of that, this is taken from American culture, so you have to believe that it is so. Inviting someone for coffee seems to be equivalent with inviting someone for sex. So the implicit meaning has been exploited so much that it now seems as if one cannot use the utterance to convey any alternative meaning but the sexually connoted one. So this is an example of transfer from the explicit continuum to the implicit continuum due to social pressure. Laurie Horn mentions one more example, that is interesting girl, and he said that it may mean that she's simply not pretty. So that will, again, within a limited, perhaps limited number of users, but still it is possible that interesting girl will just carry this explicit meaning of not pretty. Now, idioms are another difficult case. Typically, they should be ascribed to the implicit continuum, since they require extra contextual information from the hearer in order to reach the unitary meaning of the idiomatic phrase beyond the meaning of its composite words. But mind you how they are used in advertisements. Advertisers force the recipients to compute the two possible readings of the phrase, that is both explicit and implicit at the same time, in order to draw their attention to the wordplay. So they provoke the transfer from the assumed implicit meaning of the idiom to a parallel processing of its explicit meaning. Now let's perhaps analyze the following examples. So, no, I won't marry you, I don't respect you, and I could never marry a man I don't respect. I could never marry a clergyman, I refuse to marry a complete buffoon. So the speaker intends to convey a direct interpretation which only requires a minimal contextualization, such as reference assignment, disambiguation, plus the addressee's awareness of certain conventions, all needed to reach a propositional enrichment of the logical form that is explicature. So perhaps the last one, I refuse to marry a complete buffoon, we may claim that this is implicit because it demands providing some additional assumptions. But in fact, it is just a process of reference assignment, so perhaps it may again be claimed that it is just the enriched form. I refuse to marry a complete buffoon, you're a complete buffoon. But it is possible that we'll just classify, no, I won't marry you, I don't respect you, and I could never marry a man I don't respect, as belonging to the explicit level, and I refuse to marry a complete buffoon as representing the implicit continuum already. Now, so if we are back to this continuum that we mentioned at the very beginning, various combinations of them yield a typology, a classification of possible types of misunderstandings. Certain categories, however, have to be rejected. So, co-occurrence of no intentionality and verbal stimulus has to be rejected, okay? Because if we produce a verbal stimulus, it must be deliberate. Obviously, if we're talking about communication, the act of communication, which you remember, is always intended. Now, another category that must be eliminated is co-occurrence of non-verbal communication, non-intentionality, and implicit quality. Unintentional non-verbal is explicit, and there is always a link between intentionality and implicitness. If you want to express something implicitly, then it must be intended. Now, as we are dealing with verbal communication, we will not devote our time to non-verbal types of misunderstandings. So we are left with two broad categories: intentional explicit verbal and intentional implicit verbal. Within both of them, again, we can distinguish two, in fact, subcategories, which can be further subdivided. So, The first one is correct location. It means that the stimulus, the interpretation of the stimulus, is located within the appropriate continuum. We know that the message should be relevant at the explicit level or at the implicit level. But for some reason we cannot process it appropriately. For instance, we lack contextual resources or processing capabilities or things like that. Now, the other broad subcategory is when we mix the continua, that is, we derive the implicit interpretation even though it was not intended, or alternatively, we understand an utterance at the explicit level even though it was intended as the implicit message. We'll discuss them in details shortly. Theoretically speaking, a misunderstanding may take place in two ways, but we are interested only in one of them. So, when the addressee picks up an interpretation, XB, among a choice of interpretations X1 to Xn in a certain context C, which is different from the interpretation XA that the addresser wanted to communicate with a verbal or non-verbal stimulus. So that's one type. And the other, when a person interprets incorrectly the information which, without a prior communicative intention, reaches that person from the surrounding world. In other words, a wrong interpretation of exuded information. And this is the type of misunderstanding we are not interested in, because we are only interested in this intentional communication and not incidental comprehension. So we will just define the scope of our analysis. Intentionally conveyed utterances placed somewhere in the explicit continuum or in the implicit continuum. The speaker does not want to be misunderstood. This leaves out instances in which the speaker does want the hearer to choose an interpretation which is incorrect. The most pervasive source of this strategy is humorous discourse, in which the addressee's overt intention is to make one interpretation highly salient and accessible. It is later invalidated when the addresser's covert intention unfolds. So, for the time being, we are not interested in humorous discourse, and we are not interested in the situation when the speaker deliberately leads the addressee by the garden path. The speaker wants to be understood, but for some reason is not. And the speaker produces a verbal stimulus, the interpretation of which could be theoretically placed either in the explicit continuum or in the implicit continuum. So misunderstanding is viewed as a joint responsibility. The hearer's non- or misunderstanding and the speaker's misrepresentation. It is assumed that the hearers try their best to grasp the speaker's intended interpretation, but for cases of spurious non-hearing or deliberate misunderstanding are excluded from the analysis. There are four main threats to optimal interpretation of utterances in the explicit continuum. The hearer is unable to come up with any plausible interpretation of the speaker's utterance when, due to noise in the channel of communication, the speaker's bad accent, etc., the message does not reach the addressee. So this is a case of non-understanding. But we are not particularly interested in that type of misunderstanding. Another problem might be lack of required encyclopedic knowledge, which makes it impossible to access any plausible interpretation of the utterance. This is the case of very specialized jargons or specific meta-languages. Here you can distinguish two basic levels: horizontal, typically arising in cross-cultural communication, and in different linguistic varieties within the same culture, and then vertical, in conversations between experts and laymen, typically in institutional settings. Both are externally caused trouble. So again, we are not very much interested in that type of misunderstanding. So now we can proceed to such types of misunderstanding that are of interest for our analysis. We'll begin with communication problems with the explicit continuum. So the first category here is a puzzled understanding or short-circuited explicature. The hearer does identify the speaker's intention to communicate the information as an explicature, does not look for extra contextual assumptions to construct an implicature. However, he accesses a contextual assumption which, being very salient in the context of the conversation, somehow invalidates the ongoing processing and contradicts the overall sense of the supposedly intended explicature. Such misunderstandings arise because when we interpret utterances, we are supposed to understand not only words, but also the sense they acquire in a particular context. So let me explain that. As if you look one more time at the name of that category, short-circuited explicature, it means that you tend to choose a shortcut to get the explicature. That is, to the first hypothesis that comes to your mind and satisfies in a way. It's not exactly this, because the first hypothesis that comes to your mind is the least costly. So you follow the path of least effort and derive the interpretation. But this is not the intended interpretation, because perhaps in this particular context, not the typical interpretation is intended. I will give you an example of this paper case. So two ladies working in the same office. One of them is looking for some paper for Xerox machine, and the other says there is no paper. And obviously the addressee understands it as there is no paper here, perhaps not in this drawer, but perhaps it is available at some other place, because it is just unimaginable that there may be no Xerox paper in an office. But in fact, in this particular situation, there is no paper whatsoever for some reason. Okay, so she's puzzled. This is why it is called puzzled understanding, because she understands words. She knows that the sentence is relevant at the explicit level, but she simply interprets the sentence in a slightly different way. That is the way it is usually interpreted, and does not take into account the changing context. Okay, so that's what is meant by this short-circuited explicature or puzzled understanding. Another one is connected with ad hoc concepts. That is, you perhaps remember that the encoded concept is just the starting point. It triggers the whole inferential procedure by means of which you finally arrive at the intended concept. And sometimes people use particular encoded concepts in very specific senses. Here it is the word citizen that was used by one of the American participants of this conversation, in the sense that I would like to be a citizen, in the sense of I would like to be to get permanent job, and that will allow me to stabilize finally, to settle down. So a very peculiar word of use of the word citizen, of this encoded concept. So again, we understand the word citizen, and we know that it is used in the explicit sense, but we cannot arrive at this particular intended meaning, contextual meaning, circumstantial meaning of the word. So this is the reason for misunderstanding, that kind of misunderstanding. So we located the stimulus within the appropriate dimension, but still we cannot interpret it properly. Another subcategory within this class is alternative understanding. That is, the interpretation actually chosen differs from the intended one. So, for instance, it may result from faulty reference assignment. If you say he, then he theoretically may refer to many different people, and sometimes simply the addressee selects the reference that was not intended. Obviously, it may result from a faulty disambiguation or perhaps a faulty enrichment process. So we simply understand it not in the intended way. And the next subcategory it refers to the shift. That is, we believe that the sentence is not relevant at the explicit level, and that we should look for some implicit assumptions to find the intended interpretation. So the hearer is not satisfied with the information and looks for extra contextual assumptions supposedly needed to reach a more relevant implicit interpretation. The hearer turns the intended explicature into an unintended implicature. So, for instance, it might be the situation when we believe that someone asking an innocuous question is being ironic, and that someone is very critical about us. So if a person says, how many times have you read it? Then you may react like, well, what's wrong with it? What's wrong with it? Well, I'm not saying that there is something wrong with it. I'm merely asking how many times you've read it. So that's a situation when something intended as fully explicit is interpreted as an implicit level. Now, perhaps we'll proceed to the discussion of the communication problems in the implicit continuum. So the first point remains as before, and perhaps we'll just proceed to the second category. The hearer may not be able to reach the intended implicit implicature of the speaker's utterance due to his/her inability to access one or several contextual assumptions which are essential for the recovery of the implicature. So simply, you know that a particular utterance is used implicitly. I mean that we are expected to derive the implicit message, but we have no context in which we can find its relevance. Now, is John a good sailor? John is English, so obviously we should know that English are supposed to be good sailors to derive the implicature that if John is English, then he must be a good sailor. But we do not have that in our that piece of information in our contextual resources, and obviously we fail to derive this particular implicature. Another example, which might be even more convincing: nice cat. Is it female or male? It's recolored. So what? Oh, never mind, it's female actually. Now, again, the addressee is not able to derive the missing assumption. All three colored cats are female, and therefore the addressee cannot process the utterance. So the addressee knows that some implicit meaning is involved, but simply is not capable of identifying it. Another subcategory: one can select erroneous contextual assumptions leading to an alternative implicature. This is typical of novel metaphors whose implicit meanings are the hearer's responsibility. Implicit meanings in this, if the metaphor is not conventionalized, constitute an array of weak implicatures, and as it is said here, the responsibility is placed on the hearer. So if someone says something as trivial as "you are the sunshine of my life," then obviously we know how to interpret it. But if someone risks something like "you are the Empire State Building of my life," then we are at a loss and we do not know what to do with it. So obviously we may derive the interpretation that was not intended. And finally, the hearer may stop the interpretation of an utterance at the level of the proposition expressed. The hearer feels satisfied with the relevance and therefore hypothesizes that the speaker intends to communicate this proposition as an explicature. So the hearer will not continue the search. He will turn the intended implicature into an unintended explicature. So this often happens with ironic utterances. So the addressee simply does not get the irony and interprets a particular utterance literary. So it seems that the typology presented above is comprehensive and that all types of misunderstanding can be accommodated with this classification. So firstly, the hearer has to infer the quality of the speaker's utterance and decide whether it is the relevance should be searched at the explicit or implicit level. This opens a whole range of possible misunderstandings. Secondly, utterances may be ambiguous, semantically underdetermined, providing many alternative ways in which utterances can be understood, an interpretive process which runs parallel to whether the hearer correctly assigns an explicit or implicit quality to the utterance. So it seems that this typology that we've presented accounts for all possible reasons. Technical causes, perhaps not reasons, but technical causes of misunderstanding. The boundary between the explicit continuum and the implicit continuum is far from stable, even though it is supposed to be clear-cut within relevance theory. Rather, it is subject to a constant process of permeability, favored, among other constraints, by the evolution of culture of speech situations, specific communicative uses of certain utterances. Thank you for your attention.